Hi, I'm Nathan. Most people think being a Karen ends with embarrassment or a viral video, but in today's episode, their entitlement cost them far worse than their reputation. From a Karen who refused to pay and stole construction supplies, to a Karen who crashed a crane operation, giving her instant karma in the worst way possible. It was August 17, 2018, in a quiet neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. One house on the street sat empty while renovation work was being completed before new tenants moved in. For several days, neighbors had noticed growing tension around the property as a disagreement between the owner and a contractor continued to get worse. The owner was Melanie Cross, a 48-year-old woman who owned several rental properties around the area. Melanie had a reputation for being demanding when money was involved and rarely accepted being told she was wrong. A local flooring contractor named Aaron Bell had recently completed a week-long renovation inside the vacant house. The work was finished, Melanie had approved it, and Aaron expected to receive the remaining payment before moving on to his next project. Instead, Melanie refused to pay the final invoice. She suddenly claimed she was unhappy with parts of the work, despite having already signed off on the completed renovation. The dispute became even more serious when she also refused to return Aaron's equipment, which he had left inside the house, because he planned to return for final cleanup and collect the remaining materials. The tools were worth thousands of dollars and were needed for another job scheduled to begin the next day. Rather than viewing the equipment as someone else's property, Melanie treated it as leverage. Several neighbors later recalled her saying that because the tools were inside her house, she had the right to keep them until she got what she wanted. She openly talked about holding the equipment until Aaron agreed to her demands regarding the invoice. The problem with people like Melanie isn't that they're confident, it's that they often treat every disagreement like a contest that has to be won. Over the following days, Aaron repeatedly tried to recover both the payment and his equipment. According to people familiar with the dispute, he had even contacted local authorities for guidance, but was told the disagreement largely involved property ownership and payment issues that would likely need to be resolved through civil channels. Melanie rejected every attempt to settle the matter and continued insisting she was the one being treated unfairly. As the dispute dragged on, she became increasingly confident that Aaron would return because he needed the tools for work. Some neighbors later recalled Melanie describing him as dishonest and suggesting he was trying to take property that did not belong to him. Eventually, Aaron returned to the property because he urgently needed the equipment for his next job. Witnesses later said Melanie came outside shortly after seeing him arrive. An argument quickly began near the driveway as Aaron attempted to gather his tools. Several neighbors stepped outside after hearing raised voices. Multiple witnesses later reported hearing Melanie accuse Aaron of trying to steal from her. Aaron continued gathering his property, but Melanie moved in front of him and refused to let him leave with the tools. As Aaron picked up a large tool case to take it back to his vehicle, Melanie reached for it and tried to stop him from leaving. Looking back, that may have been the last opportunity either person had to end the dispute before it crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Witnesses later told investigators that Melanie continued trying to hold on to the case as Aaron moved with it toward his truck. While attempting to stop him and stepping backward on the driveway, she suddenly lost her footing. Still reaching for the equipment, she fell backward and struck the back of her head against the concrete. Neighbors immediately called for help while Aaron remained at the scene. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward and transported Melanie for treatment. Despite medical efforts, she later died from the severe head injury she suffered in the fall. What had started as a simple payment dispute suddenly became something far more serious than either side ever intended. After reviewing the investigation, prosecutors declined to file criminal charges against Aaron, finding insufficient evidence that he had intentionally caused Melanie's death. The confrontation stemmed from a dispute over unpaid work and the contractor's tools that Aaron had come to retrieve. Following the closure of the case, Aaron was eventually able to recover his equipment. Although he never received payment for the completed work, investigators concluded that the dispute over property ownership triggered the incident that ended in tragedy. Melanie turned a disagreement over property into a confrontation that spiraled far beyond the original argument. The next story follows someone who also refused to accept a simple no. It was July 22, 2021, at a veterinary clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The waiting room was crowded that morning. Several pet owners sat with their animals while workers moved quickly between treatment areas. Emergency cases had arrived one after another, causing delays for everyone else. Among the people waiting was Iana Slade, a 41-year-old office support worker. She had brought her small terrier in for a routine examination. Iana often shared videos of public disagreements online, and she liked proving her point when she felt she had been treated unfairly. That day, she was determined to show that her scheduled appointment should come before any walk-in emergency. I can understand being annoyed by a long wait, but when trained workers tell you an emergency is happening, there is usually a very good reason for it. Workers explained that emergency cases would be treated first. One involved a large working dog that had been seriously injured in a roadside accident. The animal needed immediate attention, and staff were focused on keeping it alive. As more emergencies arrived, routine appointments continued to fall behind schedule. Iana did not take the news well. She argued with the receptionist and questioned why appointment holders were being forced to wait. A veterinary technician explained the clinic's process, but she remained upset. Several people noticed her recording employees with her phone while complaining about the delay. As the morning went on, Iana overheard workers discussing the injured dog. She became convinced that the animal was the reason her appointment had been pushed back. Witnesses later said she repeatedly pointed toward the treatment area and demanded to know why the dog was receiving priority. Staff reminded Iana several times that treatment areas were restricted and that clients needed to remain in the waiting room. The situation changed when another emergency patient arrived. Several staff members were pulled away to help. During this period of activity, Iana got up from her seat and left the waiting room. Security cameras later showed her entering an employee-only hallway while still recording with her phone. The corridor connected treatment rooms, recovery spaces, and an isolation section used for animals requiring special handling. She continued deeper into the building, passing signs that marked areas closed to the public. Authorities later determined that she reached the section where the injured dog was being housed. The animal had been placed inside a secured kennel, while staff prepared for additional treatment. Warning notices were posted throughout the area. At this point, I think Iana stopped caring about her appointment. It seems like proving she was right had become more important than following the rules everyone else was following. While recording, Iana approached the kennel. Evidence later showed that she manipulated the latch while apparently trying to demonstrate that the dog was not dangerous. The kennel door opened. The injured dog immediately pushed its way out of the enclosure. Although weakened by its injuries, the animal was frightened, disoriented, and under extreme stress. Startled by the sudden movement, Iana stepped backward while continuing to hold her phone. The dog lunged forward. What happened next unfolded in only a few seconds. Workers in nearby treatment rooms heard a scream, followed by the sound of a struggle. As Iana attempted to retreat, she lost her footing and fell against equipment positioned along the hallway. The dog immediately reached her and inflicted multiple severe bite wounds before employees could intervene. The animal continued thrashing and snapping as it reacted to the chaos around it. Employees rushed toward the commotion. By the time they reached the hallway, Iana had sustained catastrophic bite injuries, along with injuries from the fall. Staff members pulled the dog away and secured it inside another enclosure while emergency services were contacted. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began life-saving treatment. Despite their efforts, Iana's injuries were too severe. She was transported for emergency care, but was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical examiner later determined that the fatal injuries were caused by multiple dog bite wounds and trauma sustained during the attack after the animal was released from its enclosure. Investigators reviewed security footage, clinic records, and witness statements. The evidence showed that Iana had entered a restricted treatment area without authorization and opened the kennel holding the injured dog. Officials concluded that releasing the animal directly triggered the chain of events that led to her death. The animal received additional treatment for the injuries it had suffered in the roadside accident and remained under veterinary supervision. After investigators completed their review, the case was closed and the clinic resumed normal operations. If Lana's story shows what can happen when someone ignores restricted areas, our next case shows what can happen when someone ignores emergency rules designed to protect everyone else. It was November 9, 2019, at a large apartment complex in Columbus, Ohio. Residents were coming and going as usual that afternoon, and vehicles filled most of the parking areas. Near one of the buildings was a clearly marked fire lane that was required to remain open for emergency access. That was where Vanessa Andre Varney parked her SUV. Vanessa was a 52-year-old office administrator who often argued about parking rules and other restrictions she felt were inconvenient. Friends described her as someone who disliked being told what to do and often looked for the easiest option available. On that day, she parked in the fire lane because she did not want to use the designated parking area farther away from the building. Residents quickly pointed out that the space needed to remain clear for emergency vehicles, and Vanessa refused to move. According to witnesses, she insisted the rule was unreasonable because she was only planning to be inside briefly. Several residents explained that emergency routes had to stay open regardless of how long a vehicle remained there, but Vanessa dismissed their concerns and continued insisting the rules should not apply to her situation. "I'll admit it, I've looked for a closer parking spot before, but it's surprising how a small decision can sometimes lead to much bigger consequences." Roughly 20 minutes later, an unrelated fire emergency developed elsewhere in the building. Smoke began emerging from one of the apartment units, triggering fire alarms throughout the complex. Residents started evacuating while staff directed people away from the building. The parking dispute itself did not cause the fire, but Vanessa's reaction to the emergency would shape everything that followed. Employees noticed Vanessa's SUV was still sitting in the fire lane and instructed her to move it and leave the area. Witnesses later stated that Vanessa never moved the vehicle despite repeated requests. Even as smoke became visible and alarms echoed through the complex, she continued defending her decision. Witnesses later said she appeared more focused on proving she was right than on the emergency developing around her. "By the time the alarm started going off, I would have forgotten the parking argument even existed." It's strange to think that Vanessa was still focused on it, while everyone else was focused on getting out safely. As smoke conditions worsened, fire crews arrived and repeatedly instructed residents to stay clear of the building. During the evacuation, Vanessa remembered that she had accidentally left a container of prescription medication in a friend's apartment during an earlier visit. Firefighters warned her not to re-enter the building. Residents also urged her to stay outside and explained that important belongings could be addressed once conditions were safe. Instead of listening, Vanessa insisted she could quickly retrieve the medication herself. Witnesses later stated that Vanessa moved toward a side entrance while firefighters and staff were focused on evacuating residents from another section of the complex. She entered the building and disappeared into a smoke-filled hallway. There are some warnings you can ignore and probably be fine. A warning from firefighters during an active emergency isn't one of them. Investigators later determined that Vanessa entered the building intending to reach her friend's apartment. By that point, smoke had spread through hallways and stairwells, making navigation difficult. Officials believe she reached the correct floor, but became disoriented after encountering heavy smoke. Unable to find the apartment or safely retrace her path to an exit, she remained trapped inside. Firefighters eventually found Vanessa unconscious during search operations and removed her from the building. Emergency responders began treatment, but she later died from smoke inhalation. Authorities determined that smoke inhalation was the direct cause of death. The fire investigation continued separately, but the timeline showed that Vanessa's repeated refusal to accept inconvenience played a central role in the decisions that placed her in danger. Investigators ultimately concluded that ignoring evacuation orders and re-entering the smoke-filled building directly led to the fatal outcome. We've got 2 more outrageous Karen disasters coming up, so hit that subscribe button if you want to see how entitlement and bad decisions can lead to deadly consequences. It was September 14, 2018, in Wilmington, North Carolina. Heavy rain had been falling for nearly 2 days. Water covered parts of neighborhood streets, and muddy runoff had started forming around homes. One of those homes belonged to Kira Lofton, a 41-year-old administrative office worker. Kira lived in a single-story house built on a raised foundation with a crawl space underneath. As the storm worsened, she became concerned about water gathering beneath her home and wanted reassurance that nothing serious was happening. Earlier that day, she requested an inspection of the property. After checking the crawl space, the inspector found storm runoff collecting beneath the structure and advised her not to enter the area until conditions improved. With rainfall continuing and water already accumulating under the house, he warned that the situation could become dangerous very quickly. Kira didn't accept the assessment. Friends and neighbors later described her as someone who rarely trusted professional opinions when they conflicted with her own. That afternoon, she uploaded videos insisting the inspection had exaggerated the danger and claiming the situation under her house was being blown out of proportion. The posts attracted attention from local residents already discussing the storm. Instead of reconsidering, Kira became more determined to prove her point. By evening, she announced that she would personally inspect the crawl space and live stream the entire thing. The thing that gets me here is that Kira was the one who asked for the inspection. She wanted expert advice, but the moment she heard something she didn't like, she decided the expert had to be wrong. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, rain continued falling. Carrying a flashlight and her phone, Kira opened the crawlspace access hatch and climbed beneath the house. The space underneath wasn't open or easy to navigate. Concrete supports, beams, pipes, and utility lines divided the area into narrow sections. In several places, the clearance was so low that she had to crawl on her hands and knees. Water was already present throughout parts of the crawlspace. While filming, Kira continued criticizing the inspector's warning and telling viewers she wanted to show what conditions actually looked like. Comments soon appeared from viewers who thought the flooding looked worse than she was describing. Some urged her to leave. Kira ignored them and continued moving deeper beneath the house. I've seen this happen before. Some people treat every warning like an insult to their intelligence. The problem is that a storm doesn't care whether you believe the warning or not. As the live stream continued, conditions beneath the house began changing faster than Kira realized. Rainfall intensified and runoff started entering the crawlspace from multiple directions. Water that had been sitting in shallow pools began flowing steadily through the low sections beneath the foundation. Several times, Kira had to lift her phone and flashlight higher to keep them out of the water. The muddy ground beneath her became increasingly slick. Moving through the cramped space required squeezing around obstacles while dragging herself through water that was steadily getting deeper. Even then, she continued forward. The further she traveled beneath the house, the farther she placed herself from the access hatch. What had started as a short crawl inward was becoming a much longer journey back out. Then, the water rose again. Small channels of runoff merged into stronger currents. Areas that had been difficult to cross became hazardous. The crawl space had become a maze of narrow passages, standing water, and structural supports. For the first time during the broadcast, Kira mentioned the rising water. Viewers later recalled hearing uncertainty in her voice. The confidence she had displayed earlier was beginning to fade. Moments later, the live stream image started breaking apart. The video froze, returned briefly, then froze again. A few seconds later, the feed disconnected completely. Family members initially assumed the broadcast had ended because of the storm, but as calls and messages went unanswered, concern quickly grew. No one watching realized it at the time. Crawl space had effectively become a flooded tunnel beneath the house. With rising water, limited visibility, and only one practical exit, the area had transformed into a trap. By the time emergency responders were able to safely access the property, extensive flooding had overtaken the space beneath the home. Kira was found beneath the structure. The official cause of death was drowning. Our next case features a woman whose need to be right led her directly into one of the most dangerous places on an active construction site. It was February 14, 2017, in Houston, Texas. A commercial property sat beside an active construction site where workers were preparing to lift a large steel beam into place. Safety barriers surrounded the work area, and warning signs had been posted to keep unauthorized personnel away from the lift zone. One of the people observing the work that morning was Arnell Baird, a 49-year-old commercial property manager. As the manager of a neighboring property, Arnell was familiar to many of the workers and was often seen near the project boundary, even though she had no role in the construction activities. According to accounts later gathered during the investigation, Arnell had become a frequent source of tension around the project. Workers stated that she regularly questioned construction decisions and often challenged procedures she believed were being handled incorrectly. Even when explanations were provided, she reportedly maintained that there was a better way to perform the work. The project had become a recurring source of frustration for her. Over the previous weeks, she had repeatedly criticized aspects of the operation and voiced concerns about how certain certain tasks were being carried out. Witnesses later stated that these disagreements had become a familiar occurrence on the site. I understand the feeling of being convinced you're right about something. The difficult part is recognizing when the people around you possess knowledge and experience that you do not. On the morning of the incident, a crane crew was preparing to move a large steel beam into position. Before the lift began, workers established a restricted area around the planned path of the load and completed the required safety preparations. Arnell arrived near the site while those preparations were underway. According to witness statements, she immediately began questioning the crew's approach and challenging aspects of the lift plan. Workers attempted to explain the purpose of the restricted area and the procedures being followed, but witnesses later stated that she repeatedly interrupted those explanations and insisted mistakes were being made. Once preparations were complete, the crane operator began lifting the beam. As the operation progressed, Arnell remained near the perimeter of the work zone and continued criticizing the work being performed. Workers instructed her to remain outside the restricted area. Witnesses later stated that she ignored those instructions and continued arguing as the lift progressed. As the suspended beam was being maneuvered, Arnell crossed the barriers and entered the restricted lift zone. Employees immediately shouted warnings and directed her to leave the area. Instead of backing away, Arnell continued arguing and moved farther into the restricted area. At one point, she positioned herself directly beneath part of the beam's path while continuing to challenge the crew. Moments later, a component connected to the rigging system failed. The failure happened without warning. The massive steel beam suddenly dropped from above and crashed into the restricted work area. Workers shouted and tried to get Arnell's attention, but there was no time for her to escape. Before she could move out of the way, the falling beam struck her and pinned her beneath its weight. There are moments when proving a point becomes irrelevant and personal safety becomes the only thing that matters. Emergency services were called immediately while workers secured the site. Despite their efforts, Arnell died from crushing injuries sustained in the collapse. Investigators later determined that the beam had fallen inside the restricted lift zone after the rigging component failed. Officials concluded that Arnell's decision to enter the exclusion area placed her directly in the path of the falling load. The construction site remained closed while the incident was investigated, and work did not resume until safety reviews and inspections were completed.